So I think most of you know me. I'm Hannah Claussen. I'm a journalism senior here at WKU, and I minor in political science. So for my capstone experience project, I chose to focus on media bias. As a journalist, it's an issue that is deeply important to me. Despite the bad apples, there are many hardworking, ethical journalists who are putting in the thankless work to keep voters informed and aware of important issues in our world. I believe it's important for news consumers to be aware of issues with the mainstream news media's political reporting so they can be more effective at filtering out opinion from reporting. My project consists of 2 in-depth news stories, a research paper, and a reflection essay. My first news story provides an overview of the issue, while my second news story focuses on the history of media bias, starting in the early 1900s and tracing it to today. And then my research paper focuses on newspaper endorsements. So why is journalism important? That's a great question. News reporters have historically served an essential role in our democracy. It was reported that British politician Edmund Burke said that there were 3 estates in Parliament, but in the reporters' gallery yonder, there sat a 4th estate far more important than them all. This phrase, the 4th estate, has come to refer to the press's job as a government watchdog. Margaret Sullivan, in her book, Ghosting the News, Local Journalism and the Crisis of American Democracy, wrote extensively about the results of local journalism dying off in small towns around the country. The result was corruption flourishing and government efficiency failing. Though her focus was on local government, there is no doubt that this applies to all levels of democracy. Without a free press, there is no one to tell the electorate what our representatives are doing or hold our government officials accountable. James A. Garfield, the 20th U.S. president, said, "Things don't turn up in this world unless somebody turns them up." This is why we have a free press. As of December of last year, 60% of Americans have little to no confidence that journalists act in the best interests of the public, according to the Pew Research Center. This is deeply concerning because our profession relies on credibility with our audiences so they can trust the news that we bring them. After all, journalism is about serving the people, not an agenda. Speaking of agendas, 74% of Americans are concerned that media company owners are influencing news coverage to push an agenda, according to a Gallup poll. This share is up 5 points since 2017. It is worth noting that though claims of media bias are typically attributed to conservatives, this is a bipartisan issue. Obviously, you don't get 4 out of every 5 Americans believing we have a slanted news media if it's only conservatives that are complaining. Some journalists have renounced the objectivity standard, calling it outdated and opting for openly biased reporting. In his acceptance speech for the Murrow Lifetime Achievement Award in Journalism in 2021, NBC News anchor Lester Holt proclaimed, quote, "Fairness is overrated, and providing a platform for, quote, misinformation is dangerous." And he's not the only one. New York Times Magazine writer Nicole Hannah-Jones told CBS News, quote, "All journalism is activism," end quote. Lauren Wolf, a former freelance editor for the New York Times who was fired over a pro-Biden tweet, wrote an opinion piece in Washington Monthly in July titled, "I'm a biased journalist and I'm okay with that." She said that being fair and having a point of view aren't incompatible, and journalists shouldn't have to disguise or suppress their views. DePaul University professor and media critic Jeffrey McCall told Fox News that he believes, quote, "There has always been a prominent role for opinion in journalism, and the First Amendment surely allows for the media to engage in activism. However, professional ethics in American journalism is to keep opinion and advocacy in a separate lane from the straightforward presentation of facts. We live in a dangerous time today, however, when professional journalists want to blend opinion and reporting into the same place," end quote. Because so few people trust the national news media, the question is, where do people turn for their news? The answer is what I call opinionists. Also known as alternative media, these are media organizations that openly favor one political side or the other. We're watching this shift happen before our very eyes. CNN's viewership dropped 90% overall in the first week of 2022, according to Nielsen ratings. The network averaged 548,000 viewers during the week of January 3rd, whereas during that same week the year prior, they averaged 2.7 million. Meanwhile, the Joe Rogan Experience podcast averages 11 million listeners per episode. The Daily Wire, a conservative media company, has grown into a $100 million a year company in only 5 years. Consumers want media they can trust, and alternative media feels trustworthy because they are openly biased and are not hiding their agenda. The widespread belief that the news media is unreliable has larger implications than news consumers being more critical of what they hear or turning to opinion sources for their news. The effects show up at the ballot boxes. Coverage of the discovery of a laptop that possibly belonged to Hunter Biden rested solely with the New York Post, which is owned by Rupert Murdoch's News Corp. They were promptly banned by major social media companies, and its official Twitter account was suspended until they deleted the tweet. The findings on the laptop, which came out right before the 2020 election, raised questions of President Joe Biden's involvement with his son's foreign business deals, including Burisma, a Ukrainian natural gas company linked to corruption, as reported by the Post. Days after the report, CNN called it, quote, dubious, end quote, and the New York Times used anonymous sources to discount the story. The Daily Beast ran a headline that stated, quote, Russian state media is desperately trying to keep their Hunter Biden story alive, end quote. And another headline read, quote, FBI examining Hunter's laptop as foreign op, contradicting Trump's internal czar, end quote. Taxpayer-funded NPR tweeted that they would not be covering the laptop story. Quote, we don't want to waste our time on stories that are not really stories, and we don't want to waste the listeners' and readers' time on stories that are just pure distractions, end quote. Hunter Biden never denied that the laptop was his. He said it, quote, certainly could be his in an interview with CBS Sunday Morning. Cabot Phillips, a writer, editor, and commentator at the Daily Wire, said that there's post-election polling that showed if people knew that about the Hunter Biden laptop, it might have influenced the way they voted. In March 2022, the New York Times published a story with the headline, quote, Hunter Biden paid tax bill, but broad federal investigation continues, end quote. In the story, the Times reported in paragraph 24 that the laptop in question was confirmed to be Hunter Biden's. But left-leaning media aren't the only skewed ones. Vox compiled a diagram comparing Fox News' coverage of prominent news stories during the Trump administration with parallel coverage from MSNBC and CNN. Vox found that Fox News covered mainstream media and fake news significantly more than the other channels, as well as Hillary Clinton and tax cuts. However, they gave significantly less coverage to the Robert Mueller and Russia investigation, Donald Trump in general, and almost no coverage to Stormy Daniels' allegations that she had an affair with the president in 2006. During the Capitol siege on January 6, 2021, multiple Fox News hosts, including Sean Hannity, Laura Ingraham, and Brian Kilmeade, sent texts to White House Chief of Staff Mark Meadows, urging the president to make a statement and tell people to go home. Representative Liz Cheney, a Republican from Wyoming, revealed the texts during a House committee hearing not aired on Fox News. The texts were also not discussed on Fox that day, even during Hannity's show with Meadows as his guest. News media bias remains a prominent topic in public discourse, particularly since Donald Trump began running for president and harping on, quote, fake news. But media bias became a mainstream issue long before Trump arrived on the public's radar. It becomes a more serious problem when journalists report unethically, select stories with an agenda, ask slanted or leading questions, choose facts or quotes to fit a personal premise, or invent information outright. Dr. Andy Tucker, a media historian and journalist who is the director of the doctorate program at Columbia Journalism School, said that there have been several cycles of declining trust, with journalists making a deliberate effort to be more trustworthy at the beginning of the 20th century. She also said that journalism declined in the 1920s and 1930s, but had sort of a bounce back to some extent during World War II, because people really needed to understand and trust what was going on. They believed the government and they believed that the military were doing their best. Conservative alternatives to media outlets, publishing houses, and broadcasts began springing up in the 1950s. Conservatives were convinced that the government contributed to the liberal bias in the news media through the Federal Communications Commission, mostly through the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine required FCC-licensed TV and radio stations to A, devote airtime to controversial issues of public importance, and B, air opposing views on those issues. Translation: a broadcast station could not present a hot-button issue from one side of the debate. But some believed the FCC stunted controversial reporting, partially because broadcasters didn't want to hand out free airtime. Conservatives believed they were silenced through the lack of reporting on controversy. On July 26, 1963, the FCC released a public notice that they would look at substance rather than to label or form when evaluating a station's Fairness Doctrine compliance. It is immaterial whether a particular program is presented under the label of Americanism, anti-communism, or states' rights, the notice said. The FCC and conservatives believe that these labels belong to conservative ideas. Some believe that the FCC targeted conservatives because they challenged the status quo of reporting. Conservative broadcasters saw themselves as the response to the liberal bias masked by objectivity that dominated mainstream news media. Some believe the FCC dedicated its government sway to propping up the liberal bias in the media and suppressing opposition. After reconsidering the rule, following a congressional resolution to do so, the FCC revoked the doctrine in 1987, leading to a red wave of conservative talk show hosts in the late 1980s and early 1990s, including Rush Limbaugh's national radio show in 1988. Limbaugh's message struck a nerve with an underrepresented blue-collar portion of the population. His success inspired many to abandon the objectivity standard in mainstream news reporting. The 1960s saw a rise of conservatism as a movement, resulting in Barry Goldwater's failed presidential bid against President Lyndon B. Johnson. Rich Shumate, an assistant professor in Western Kentucky University's School of Media and author of Barry Goldwater, Distrusting the Media and Conservative Identity, the Perception of Liberal Bias in the News. He traced media bias to the early 1960s, where he said conservatism came to the forefront as a political movement. Many political analysts believe Goldwater's campaign was one of the worst in American history. Shumate said that the coverage of his campaign was brutal, because he ran such a bad campaign. Conservatives believed that the media was dumping on Barry Goldwater, and that's when this started. Conservatives argued that the media was secretly liberal, an argument Nixon happily adopted. Shumate noted that 1965 was when liberal bias started creeping into the lexicon. By the 1980s, conservatives were adamant that the only trustworthy news sources were conservative ones because the rest were slanted to the left. Fox News, after entering the airwaves in 1966, topped CNN's ratings in just 5 years. Fox filled the need for cultural and political debate from a conservative perspective. However, Fox critics quickly point out that the network isn't as eager to cover anything that runs counter to the conservative image. For decades, newspapers have endorsed candidates in races from city council to the White House. Despite being an election season trademark, what impact does the endorsement have on voters? The consensus seems to be that presidential endorsements don't have a significant effect. It is important to understand that endorsements are not made by those reporting the news, but by a separate entity known as the editorial board. Editorial boards decide as a group which candidates to support and why, independent from those who cover and write the news. Some newspapers choose to endorse candidates because they believe it would be an abdication of their leadership role to sit out elections. Some discontinued their endorsements for fear of alienating a portion of their audience. Though the editorial board responsible for endorsements are separate from the news department, many people don't understand that. They just see that the paper endorsed a candidate, and many editors see a risk to credibility because of that. The fact is, as far as presidential races are concerned, information on candidates is readily available and easily found. But for local races, most people aren't familiar with the candidates, even though local offices shape our communities. Local media outlets and newspapers are the only ones that will be covering these races, and they're the only ones with the time and resources to interview and thoroughly research candidates for their readers. The media's role in elections is hardly diminishing, but rather growing and affecting electoral behavior on a greater scale. As political polarization grows, the bias of mainstream media outlets grows with it, perpetuating a cycle of one-sided information and half-baked opinions. To truly grow past the tendency to demonize the other side of the political aisle, we must learn to seek out the facts beyond the commentary on cable news shows and learn from other points of view. Thank you.
Okay, good.